Hello all, welcome to Tiptop C# tutorial series. Today we'll be looking at one of the basic feature of a class, that is property. The agenda for today will be we'll understand what are properties first, we'll have some hands-on, and at the end we'll try to understand some tips and tricks that can be asked in the interview. By end of the session, you will be able to understand property and also will be able to answer following questions. Which OOPS concept property tries to address? Why properties are required in .NET? Explain internal implementation of the property. By definition, property is a member that provides a flexible mechanism to read, write, compute the values of a private field. Properties can be used as if they are public data members, but they are actually special methods called as accessors. This enables data to be accessed easily and still helps promote the safety and flexibility of a method. Properties we can, in a general way, we can consider as a wrapper around a field or a private field which we want to protect. It's a simple definition. It does way more than this, but to understand or to begin with, we can understand. The syntax of the property is as shown here, where you will specify the access modifier, whether it is private, public, protected, or internal, whatever it may be. Data type, you want to specify the type of property. It may be int, string, or a reference type, or a structure type, and you need to give a property name. This is the basic structure of a property. After this, you need to provide either get or a set. Let's move. Property, as I already mentioned earlier, is a wrapper around a private field. As you can see in the PPT, that my first name is a private field which you want to provide a flexibility which can be accessed outside. Then you can provide a property called as first name, where you provide a getter and a setter. Let's move to Visual Studio to understand more. For ease of understanding, I already created a project and kept. So let's create a class. This time let it be an student class, student info. Imagine you have a private field, that is my first name. If you want to provide a public accessor for this one, then you can provide it using property. As I have said, first will be the access modifier, second one will be the data type, third one will be name, first name, where you provide a getter, how to get this one, what you want to return, and set. So I'll return my first name and I'll set my first name. This is how you can define a simple property. If we observe carefully, properties enable a class to expose a public way of getting and setting the values while hiding the implementation or verification code. A get property, or you can see that get accessor, is used to return a property value. You can return value whichever you want to return. You already specified the type. And set property is used to assign a new value. Whenever you want to assign a new value, you will be assigning in a set. So where here you are getting property and here you are setting the property. Value keyword is used to define the value being assigned by the set. As you can see, a special keyword called as value, where it points out the value that is being assigned. Now you may get a question. Why do we need property? The same can also be achieved by having a public member variable. So let's define a public member variable and understand the difference. So let's define a public member variable, public string my last name. I'll have this as public. If you see the first case, I have defined a private field and a property for it, whereas for my last name, I am having a public. Now, if you see, now let's see how we get advantage by having a property. As you can see, setter we are assigning value directly. We can have a validation check where you can check that if not string dot is null or empty, where now if you see carefully, you can see that I am able to provide an additional conditional check where I specify that if it is null or empty, then don't use this one. But whereas if you are having a public member variable, you cannot have a validation check on that one. It gives that extra flexibility that is needed for the validation whenever user is providing the input. Apart from it, it may be a case where you want to have a private set. Let's define an object of the class INC student info equals to new student info. Now if you see first name, I've made set as private. If I try to assign some value, it will show an builder error telling that it cannot be used because accessor does not present, but I can get the value. If I need to extract this one, then I can get it. So property provides you an extra flexibility where you specify what is public, where here I am specifying it as it's an public get, and private set where the value for the first name can be set only inside the class, but you can access it outside the class. But if you look at for the other one where we have defined a public member, you cannot achieve that one. Moving on, either you can have a, let's make it as private. Another advantage that you are having is you can have dynamic properties. Like imagine you are having two, one is first name, another one is last name. If you want to provide another property called as full name, get, I want to provide a getter. Now you can see that full name is a dynamic property where you are calculating the output every time. Whenever user tries to get the value, you will add my first name and last name and return it. So these are the main advantages that it gives. One is you can have a validation check, like as I'm specified here, where you don't want to assign a value which is null or empty, or it can be read-only properties where you want to provide writing access within the class, but whereas reading access you want to provide outside the class as well. And third one is the dynamic property where you calculate every time whenever the user tries to access the value. Moving on, I'll switch to PPT now. As you can see on the diagram, this is a basic property. Property validate input data. In properties, as I already shown you, you can validate the input data. You can specify that value is not null. Different access modifier where you can see that get is a public and set is private. Properties can be read only or dynamic as well, where you dynamically calculate every time. Now here user wants to have full name. You can either have full name my first name and space last name, because every time it is calculated. If first name and last name changes, the full name will also change. If we go back to our first PPT, we had a question that which OOPS concept does property advertise or property implements? The answer is encapsulation. So let's try to understand how property supports encapsulation. Let's switch to Visual Studio. Consider the above example where the full name is calculated by adding my first name and my last name. After some time, you realize that this is not the right way of providing the full name. Instead, you want to change it in this way, where you want to provide last name at the beginning, and then you want to provide the space, or you want to provide a comma and a space. Now imagine your internal implementation has been changed. But for external world, or if somebody who is using full name, they doesn't know, or the user outside your class need not to know how the implementation has been changed. Client just need to know that there is a property called as full name. It need not to know how internal implementation works. That's how it advertises or it implements encapsulation to the fullest. This is how property helps us to encapsulate internal logic with well-structured public property. Let's switch back to PPT. Property and encapsulation goes hand in hand. As I have shown in code, the same thing you can see in PPT as well. Full name, we have changed it from first name plus space to last name comma first name. There is another thing called as atomic properties. If we define properties without having an explicit field, the property is called as automatic properties. Let's switch to Visual Studio to have a atomic properties. I want to have ID as a property where I just define get and set. So this is called as automatic properties where it does not have a backing of a field, or it's not wrapper around a field which already exists within the student. Defining an auto property is pretty simple, but it comes with its own disadvantage. You cannot add a validation check because you are not setting anything internally. So you cannot have a validation check for the value that is being set. But this will be widely used in serialization and deserialization, where you will have an attributes mentioned over a property, whether it can be serialized or it should not be serialized, and serialization deserialization logic assigns directly value to the auto properties. There was another question we had mentioned at the beginning, that is, what is internal implementation, or how does .NET treats property? So let's try to implement a parallel for a property. I'll imagine I want to achieve the same functionality but without using property. How I can implement this is public string get my first name, my first name, public string. I need to have two methods, one for get, one for set. Set my first name. Here I will have validation check if I want, where I'll tell that is null or empty. And then I need to pass value here, string. I want to name this as value. Then I will assign the value to. So this behavior and this behavior will be exactly same. Here I am providing explicitly two methods where one is to get my first name and I am returning the value. This is a setter method where I am trying to set a value. If you see in later point of time, if I want to have another logic where I don't want to have value, equals, imagine I don't want somebody with series. So I can have multiple validation checks if I want. So the same thing can also be done over here. Defining a property is like having two methods. One is getter method, another one is setter method. If we define explicit properties, either we can have getter as the public and setter as the private. In the same way, here also you can have a public setter, public getter, and a private setter. Either you can exchange in other way where you have a private getter, and a public setter. So this is how the internal implementation will be. Getter and setters are treated as individual methods where the internal code is executed. This is property is not a field, is not a method, it's in between both, which provides an extra flexibility of validation or dynamicism where you calculate values dynamically, or it may be anything sort of these things. Let's move back to PPT. Let's try to moving on. Let's try to understand some tips and tricks. Get, set are optional, but need one of them for the property. Get and set both are optional, but you need to have either set or get. You cannot have a property without get and set both. Properties without backing field are called as auto properties. Dot, .NET C# consider property as a method. It can have two methods or one method. One is getter method, another one is setter method. Either you can have only getter, you can have only setter, or you can have different access modifier for same things. Property advertises or implements encapsulation. So to remember all these things when you are attending any of the interview, these may be asked. That should cover most of the properties. Thanks. Have a nice day.